Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar. It's going to talk about JUnit and TestNG. Actually, that's basically what I have to say about it. I'll get into more details in a few things. If I'm going to say it just last time, if you're joining in, want to write something in the chat window, write it for everyone to see, all panelists and attendees. If there are questions that you want to ask, put them in the Q&A panel so I won't miss it. Thank you in advance. Yeah. Who am I? That's a good reminder for who I am. I'm Gil. I'm a consultant. I work with people, developers, testers, other people too. Anything that is connected to making software better. And you can reach me at gil@testng.com. One of the things that I do is I teach TDD and unit testing, and I actually have a book about it called Everyday Unit Testing. Also have a book called Everyday Spring Testing, which is about spring testing, which doesn't happen just in the spring in some strange reason. Apart from that, you can catch me up on testinghill.com, which is also everydayunittesting.com. I blog there, and Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever you want, I'm there all over the universe. If you are interested in if me helping you in some ways, regarding, for example, which framework to choose, testing framework, you can hit me up on gil@testinghill.com or tal, which is basically the same letters, just two changes, and we'll help you almost immediately. So why am I doing this webinar? I'm fairly new to the Java world, so I've been here like, I don't know, 5, 6 years, something like that. I know it's not that new, but compared to my origins in C++ and C#, which goes back like 20 years ago. And when I started doing unit testing in Java, I obviously went with JUnit. I always knew that TestNG was there, and we'll take a look how long it was there in a minute or so. But recently, I just finished a course I did to a company, and they're working with TestNG. So I said, let's see what's out there. Let's see how TestNG is different than JUnit, and how do they compare. So this is what it's all about, and NG, next generation. That's why we have Picard here. What is for the last time? So this is something I've seen for I think few weeks ago for the first time, and I started pushing this comic everywhere and everywhere I talk. So this comic, for the people who don't follow the squares as I do, this is about Michelangelo, and everybody praises his work. And at the end, somebody says, "If I want to be this good, what kind of chisel do I buy?" If you want to be good at testing, automation, whatever you do, it's not about the tools. So specifically, this session, which is about tools, it won't make you a great unit tester or a great TDDer or whatever. What will make you great, which is something that we all want to be, is practicing. The tools themselves, they are not. I'm not going to tell you secrets. I'm going to tell you opinions, but I'm not going to tell you secrets today. Everything's documented, well documented. So whatever you do, pick a tool. I'll tell you my recommendations at the end, but that's just the beginning. After you pick the tool, then the actual work starts. So yeah. So let's go back in history, back in time, to the prehistoric days, before there was a JUnit. And we're talking 97. So like 24 years ago. JUnit was written by Kent Beck on a flight from Zurich to Atlanta. So that's like an 8-hour flight, and he was looking for something to do, and this is what he built. It was not the first unit test framework. There was something before it in Smalltalk, but very few people were actually programming in Smalltalk. So JUnit basically, yes, started in 97. And after that came a bit of history. So if this is a timeline of when the frameworks actually came out, I couldn't find a reference of when JUnit 2 was actually produced, but JUnit 3 was around 2004. So that's 7 years after JUnit. You see that TestNG also came out in 2004, something like that. JUnit 4 came out 2006, like 2 years later. Only JUnit 5 started work in 2015, but came out in 2017. So there was a long stretch between 2006 and 2017 that actually nothing happened in the test frameworks. Sure, there were features coming in and out of JUnit and TestNG as well. But the interesting part happened when TestNG came out, because it was like 7 years of JUnit controlling the territory. And this is where we come into the area of opinionated software. So the people who wrote TestNG thought that JUnit was doing a good job, but not good enough, according to their opinion. And JUnit continued. JUnit 3 actually was a major change because it introduced annotations. So you would write like a test on top of a test, which is kind of new. But before that, it wasn't. It was you had to begin a test with test. So the prefix would be identified by the test engine and run it. So TestNG also came out with annotations. So everything sort of new in TestNG. JUnit 4 was continuing the evolution of JUnit 3, and TestNG kind of took a parallel path, and things came out like in parallel paths, and I'll tell you where we are today. Everybody, if please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box, and I'll go to that in the end. I'm trying to follow the chat, so if there's something important, write it in the chat, but I don't promise anything. So that's basically the Marx Brothers. No, actually, it's JUnit and TestNG. So that's the history. And you can see that since 2004 and 2006 and 2017, not a lot happened in the test framework world, which is kind of telling you something, right? That tools were good enough back then. JUnit 5 was actually rebuilt from, like, they took it apart, and the JUnit 4, they took it apart and rebuilt it. Not because of the greatest new features, which I'm going to talk about, but just for extensibility. And if you think about what happens in the testing world outside the test framework, you see that it's mostly integration with tools and CI and stuff like that, and Spring. So things had to be like rebuilt from the top. TestNG didn't go through this revolution, it's just evolution over that. So if you look at JUnit 5, which was kind of rebuilt when they started working on it in 2015, you'll see that it looks a lot like TestNG. Also JUnit 4, but yeah, there's a couple of concept that those might be even stolen from TestNG. I'm not blaming anyone. So what you have today is in JUnit 5 is that something that's very similar to what we have in JUnit 5, like say JUnit 4 as an evolution, but also a few things coming from TestNG, which is kind of revealing what I'm going to reveal. So There's asking what is the purpose of this tool. So both JUnit and TestNG are test frameworks tools. They are test frameworks, which means they have like basically three parts, but two purposes. One is identifying and running the tests, and second is reporting them. There's a third one, which is kind of integrating it into the software development process, which means that if you don't just run a test framework on your computer, but as part of a development team, you'll get a report back saying, yes, we have these tests, they ran, this is what we got as a result. So going back to our story, JUnit 5, TestNG, this is what we have as a selection of tools now. If you look at the code of both of them, after you understand a bit, you'll see that it's that simple, because this is what test frameworks do. Basically, they have a way to identify tests. These are the annotations, run them as an engine, report them as a report, and they have asserts, so they can fail or pass tests. So they're not really complex, which is okay because they do exactly what we want them to do. I want to mention, though, that although these are just tools, and the selection of either is not like making a life or death decision, you do need to understand that when you're testing, where you're taking a tool, you're not just taking this tool. There's some kind of ecosystem around it. So JUnit was kind of like the touchstone, the basic thing that testing for continuous integration and reporting was built. The main standard structure of whatever every continuous integration system works with is called the JUnit XML standard. So it has to be like in a certain XML structure. That also means that other tools are working with it, especially plugins. So I'm going to show you things in IntelliJ, but I developed the examples in Eclipse. And one of the main problems that I had was finding and installing the Eclipse plugin for running the TestNG tests. Now, you don't think about it like I'm going to select a test, but yeah, you're going with that as well. In IntelliJ, though, it kind of worked from the start. So, and why is that? The reason is that basically, while JUnit is kind of new, sort of, TestNG is getting old. You still get support. Last version, I think, that got patched out was I think the beginning of the year. But if you look at the release notes, not much is added over time. Project has moved around a bit, but the plugin, the Eclipse plugin story signifies to me that we need to remember that when we're selecting a tool, it's not just a tool, things that come with it as well. So we might not think about what we're selecting at this point, but yeah. So after my short research, I found out that basically at this point today, JUnit and TestNG are basically similar. So what I want to cover with you is 10 features in both TestNG and JUnit. And I'm going to talk about the different facets and what they impact, and how I look at these things. And I hope you learn a bit. First, if you don't know about these features, cool, that's good. I want you to learn as well. But if also um, see that the differences are not that big. So I'm going to switch to my code. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is asserts. Let me start with TestNG. TestNG and JUnit both have assert true and assert equals. Basic APIs. You don't expect test frameworks not to have them. If you write matches with a ham crest or use assert this, obviously it doesn't matter which you're using, they're both working with. I do want to mention a couple of things that I found out while looking at it. So you see that both, I'm looking at the TestNG version, and it has an assert fail, and JUnit has this as well. If I run this test, you'll see once it finishes, obviously it failed. It has assertion error null. Why is it null? It's because I haven't put in any message here. If I put a string there, it will show the message. Now, remember that one of the main things of a test framework is to give you feedback of what happened, not just in terms of red or green, but what happened. And if you have an assertion error with nothing, I feel it's kind of sloppy. If we look at the JUnit part, I'll talk about assert all in a minute. When this fails, it will show you that, where is it? It'll get assertion failed error, which is different than a regular assertion equals or something like that. So, and no message. It's a bit more descriptive. And I think this is where JUnit gets a few more points. The other thing is something new with JUnit 5. It's called assert all. It's called grouped assert. And basically, it lets you run all the assertions in one go. If one of them fails, the third one, obviously. So it'll give you multiple failures, how many of them, and a list of the assertion failed, a list of the failures. So that's a cool thing. Is it that important? Usually no. Well, when you're doing unit tests, you usually don't expect more than a couple of asserts. The thing is that in JUnit before, if the default was not to run all the asserts, once an assert failed, it would just stop the test and not continue. So this gives you like a more expressive way to do all kinds of asserts before it fails a test, but you can change the default run. So not much of the asserts thing. Let's talk about exceptions and catching exceptions. So if you work the JUnit 3 and 4, and TestNG kind of goes back to this kind of standard where you specify the expected exception as part of the test annotation. This haven't changed much. JUnit changed that. I'll show you that in the middle. And JUnit, show you that. It has an assert throws API. You pass it a lambda expression and tell what to expect, and this will pass if the exception gets thrown. Why do I like this better? Because this goes more like the arrange act assert part. The old version of JUnit and the current version of TestNG is more like an assert, what I expect to be, and the arrange act, which kind of breaks the model of how we read tests. We kind of this is the only thing that is actually different. If you had some experience with the JUnit 4 and before that you had something like a rule, JUnit rule, which you put in part of the class, this was clunky, and the JUnit got rid of that as well. So basically the same thing. Another thing though is that if you look closely, you'll see the TestNG version that you need to put throws, declare what kind of exception is going to be thrown, because we don't have like a try catch block like we have in inside the assert throws. Does that matter a lot? Not a lot, but this is kind of noise. I use that a lot when I write Spring tests because everything throws some kind of an exception. And I want to have my tests are clean as possible, noiseless as possible. And this is kind of a noise, and I'm not blaming the TestNG writers, but this is why I like the JUnit version better, less noisy. Next one, description. So I know I'm going with TestNG first always because that's how. So TestNG comes with a description, so it's part of the test. So it's a way to describe the tests. If I run this test, you'll see that the name is better description, but the description doesn't appear here. JUnit 5 has something new called display name that does appear in the report. If I run this, you'll see that this is a displayed name, replaces the name of the actual test. Why is that important? Everything in comments, and that includes descriptions like this, makes sense only when you look at the code. Sometimes we don't look at the code. So this will be in the continuous integration report. We'll see that. So if we want to give it another description of what we're doing, it's going to be there. If it were going to give a description of why we're doing that, which we probably wouldn't put in the name of the test, it's like comments exactly. So it suffers from the same things. A, you need to look at the code in order to understand why, and B, it may remain like that. Both of them are strings though, so they suffer from the main problem with comments that they may not be updated. The cool thing though is that if you work with JavaScript and stuff like that, Ruby or Python, they have better display name. The idea came from there, and you don't need to put everything in the name of the test. If you suffer from allergy to long method names, the display name gives you a better way to express yourself. This is JUnit 5 feature. It's not from JUnit 4. So how about ignoring tests? So I want to run this though, because I haven't tried it here before I do that. And while I do that, you'll see that in TestNG, we have a test enabled false. Also, you have the ignore part, which actually worked here. Because in Eclipse, the plugin doesn't run this. So here ignore works. So you can either use enabled false on a specific test, or use ignore on the class or the tests to do everything, much like JUnit. Just remember that this doesn't run, at least it didn't run, it actually ran for me in Eclipse. So I was kind of surprised. It's not TestNG thing, but it's a TestNG integration thing. JUnit changed its name from ignore to disabled. I'm not sure why. Note though that again, it's an integration thing. If I run the JUnit thing, you'll see that it was not run, but it looks like an ignored. Well, when I ran the TestNG things, it looked like it didn't run at all. So that's the TestNG engine, though. It doesn't report that it actually ran the tests. So you'll see the tests run 0. Is that good? Again, not earth-shattering, but you might want to know your count of ignored tests. So JUnit kind of brings it up if you want to, and you probably want to get rid of ignored tests in your code. Basically, they are just noise and confusing noise, because somewhere in the future, someone is going to ask, why is this test here while this implementation does something not so according to this test? So I like this version. This is an engine feature. Okay, now you see that's there's a missing something between 4 and 6, because I'm not going to show you an example, but I am going to talk about concurrency. I think JUnit 4 after TestNG introduced parallel execution. So both of them, both JUnit 5 and TestNG, allow you to run tests in parallel. You can control the thread pool, what is the maximum limit of tests that you're going to run in parallel, and a few more. So you can actually control everything. I'm not going to show you that. It looks very similar. I just want to give you a very thing that we kind of concentrate on the tool, but when things start to break when you're running things in parallel, it's usually not because of the tests, it's because of the code. So regardless of whether you get TestNG or JUnit to run your parallel tests, you need to make sure that your code can run in parallel. And usually the code is not written in a way to be run like this. Sometimes when we're thinking of code, when we write the code, it's either we don't think how it's going to be run, or we're going to run them in separate containers or something like that. But running them inside a test or in parallel tests is a part of its testability features, testability compatibility. And a lot of the time when we see fragile tests, or we see tests breaking or inconsistency in how they run and what the results are, and we kind of blame the tests, it's not the tests, usually the code behind it. So both give you the engines to run things in parallel, both TestNG and JUnit, but the code needs to be ready for it. Usually it's not. No example. Give you an example, the next one, which is timeouts. What happens if you run longer than you expect operation? Now, when you're doing unit testing, that shouldn't happen. Integration testing or end-to-end or whatever, because both engines support that. You might want to do something, and that something is fail the test if something goes too much or too long. So both TestNG and JUnit lets you do that. So you'll see that test timeout value only allows you to specify in milliseconds. So if I run this, you'll see that I get a thread timeout exception and the method took too long. What I did here is an experiment though. You see that I printed out something after the long operation. And that means that the timeout here is the timer of the engine. So it breaks out after this timeout and fails the test. Okay? JUnit has something similar. It's called a timeout annotation. You can specify it with a bit more Options, see milliseconds, days, hours. If you run something for days, call me, probably need some help. So this does the same thing. It breaks out after the timeout that I specify here. It's called a timeout exception, timed after 1000 milliseconds. It didn't print out this. However, JUnit has something that is called an assert timeout, which is a separate assert. You get the duration and you give it a lambda. If you run this one, you see it does fail the test but completed the running of the block, which is different than what we had here. Why is this important? The two versions I showed you for TestNG and this one don't have an option to clean after themselves because the engine breaks the run. This one does. So if you're already doing something out of the world of integration tests, like something with databases or files or network, whatever, and it's going to take a while and you want to fail the test for a timeout, you probably need a way to not just fail the test, but also to clean up after the operations. So let the operation complete. Don't leave it like in halfway state that you don't know what it is, and maybe clean after yourself. And this is a better way to write test, much cleaner, because you have control of where you leave the test. So the assert timeout is much better than the ones that we have in TestNG and JUnit 4. That's also a JUnit 5 feature, but I really suggest using assert timeout if you actually want to do something like fail a test or rebuild because of a length of an operation. It's not that useful by itself, but if you actually do use it, want to use it like a verification test, like if you want to run it like it's not a functional thing, but we want to put a limit on how things are going, and you want to actually test the timeout, which is not much of a functional thing. This is what you probably want to use. JUnit 3 and 4 and 5, and TestNG as well, had something called the parameterized tests. It's a way to write a test once and run it many times with different parameters. Usually a test doesn't have parameters, but parameterized tests do. They're also known as data-driven tests. The way you do it in TestNG is for the test, you specify a method called a data provider. This is the name of the method. It's here. And you specify the annotation data provider with the same name. And you give it, basically what this is going to do is provide two sets of values, this one and this one. And for each run, it will inject as parameters here. So for example, 3 plus 1 should equal 4, 5 plus 4 should equal 9, and will fail on this test. So if I run this, there was a question whether we're talking about unit tests in the, I'm expecting that in the former example, it's not unit test, but a lot of people just use JUnit and TestNG as engines for running whatever tests they are. So I'm just specifying that. Going back to parameterized, you'll see that here I get a report that's saying parameterized method, which section, and what kind of failure. It's not, I can see that it failed. I get what happened expected in actual, and that's basically it. In the Eclipse version, though, I get I get something like that. It's different. And remember in a minute when I see the JUnit part. JUnit has the same thing, a bit more elaborate though. It has, you can specify different sources like a file or a comma separated value like we have here on the test itself. So if I run this, it's a bit more better reporting, I think. This is tells you um, that it's part of this, and this is set number 1, and this is set number 2. Not that different. I think the plugin works differently than rather than the engine itself. It also has a way to use a method source, a method factory, just like TestNG allows you to put things here. TestNG JUnit allows you to also return a stream of arguments, which is kind of nice here. You can with the method factory, you can like build things whatever you in what way you want. Build an array of objects like TestNG or a stream or array as well in JUnit. The parameterized test, though, they took in the JUnit 5 world, they took it a bit further. They also have a repeated test. It's a way to run a test multiple times with a counter. So you see that if I run this test, it kind of prints calling customer number for each one. You see repetition 1 of 3, 2 of 3, 3 of 3, and prints out the message. So is that really useful? I'm not sure, unless you actually want to run things with the counter, do a function with it. You can do that. If you're running a statistic test, like you're running multiple data and the counter is important for debugging stuff, maybe. So it's less parameter to specify. That's basically it. JUnit 5 is a bit more flexible in the way you can provide these arguments. But other than that, well, TestNG only has the factor method, but you can do everything with the factor method. You can read something from the file as well. So you have all the options in TestNG as well. Now, we come to grouping, and when TestNG came out, I think that the main draw of that was like I can group everything, group all the tests in whatever combination I actually want. It has a suite of tests, which is outside the code. You can do things like a suite in the XML file, which nobody uses today. You have things like a code that you can run for classes and for groups, and you can specify which code to run, which kind of setup before the group or after the group, and you can specify each test to what group it actually belongs, and tests can belong to multiple tests. Tests can belong to multiple groups, sorry. And you can actually do that and group everything. JUnit kind of, they have something like a group, it's called a tag. Okay, same as group, multiple tags belonging to multiple groups. They don't have the suite too much in terms of running code before and after. Class is perfectly good for that. Now, like I said, this was like the power feature of TestNG, but I feel that it's too much of a feature in terms of if you actually want to do something with it, it's so much maintenance just to work with it. And that's not a TestNG thing. It's also working with the tags. Everything here is strings. So like misspelling could have a problem. Deleting this row by error can have a problem. Moving tests between groups is work. So this is like having too much options, and I guess why, at least in the JUnit world, I've never seen people use that. And because I'm guessing it's too much work and maintenance to do that, and not much more than people actually want, except like putting the files where they think they should be. So yes, it's a super feature, but I don't think it's much useful. Also in the about the TestNG and JUnit. There's a question about repeating. The repeating test runs in parallel or one by one. This is a very good question. I think it's sequential. I don't remember. I think it's either sequential, but I think a better guess would be it depends on the configuration of the test if you run it in parallel, because every test runs from top to end. So if you have like a setup for the repeated test, it would run not once, but for every sequence of the test. So I'm guessing now better is that it's if you run it in parallel, if you run your tests in parallel, it run them in parallel as well. I'm guessing. Haven't tried it. So. Okay, so the next one is about running things out of order. And this is, I call it the no-no section. Don't do that. Yeah. Both TestNG and JUnit give you an option to select in some way the order of running the tests. Yeah, you know where I'm going with it. Don't do that. So how do you do that? In TestNG, you specify what you should run first, like depends on methods. So here you say depend on method add after reset. So, and this too. So that means when it runs, it will run this first and these two later after that. So when it's going to run, it's going to create a list of how to run it and execute this list. If it runs things in parallel, it will make sure that the dependents will run after the dependee. JUnit has something like that as well. You can specify the order of tests within a class. You can now that this one, you can run it in alphanumeric or random order. Order annotation means that it's going to run according to the explicit order annotation that you write it down. I think the alphanumeric one is the default one. Now, why am I saying don't play with that? Especially not the random one. We always say, I always say, that specifically in unit tests, but it becomes even more problematic in integration tests, we want to have the ability to do what I did until now, like press this arrow here and run the test regardless of what came before it or after it. Unit tests, it's like a must-have. We run tests in isolation, and we don't depend on anything, and that to be there. Now, if you take it to integration tests, like if your test has to do something before something like it kind of relies on data that was left there in the database, this will fail because the dependent test didn't run. Now, that's a bad design for tests. You don't want to do that. You want each test to be run alone or as part of a group or whatever. The random part also adds to that in terms of the bigger the tests, the bigger the dirt that it leaves behind. And therefore, if you want to reproduce what happened, You may not see what happened before that. You'll have the report. You'll know what will happen. But tying the things together to see what actually happened here, like a detective, you spend a lot of time. What I find is that people don't and shouldn't rely on order unless there's some kind of run a verification test. You run something um, before that, uh, unless there's a Java runtime method of a version, there's no point of running the rest of the test. But that I would put in a different suite of tests or different class of tests, because I wouldn't put them in the middle of this thing. So it's better to separate the concerns, but JUnit felt a bit bold, and actually I didn't show you that in the grouping part. Added a couple of conditional tests, like this one's enabled on OS. This will not run on, it will enabled on JRE version on OS. This will not run. It will see as an ignored. Or we'll discover this actually worked. Interesting. In Eclipse, it will say it's ignored because it shouldn't run here. That's interesting. Don't play with these things. They are hard to maintain. People will not remember. Exactly like here. If you look at the report and you see that it's passed and it didn't actually run, you'll think that this is actually worked. So it's more confusing. So everything that's playing with order or dependency or conditional environments, make sure to separate them from the rest of the test. So when you get a report, you actually get the actual face value. What you also see, I didn't talk about it, JUnit in 5 introduced nested tests. So that's a way to group tests together, which doesn't appear in TestNG. I use that, but at the end of the road, I usually take the nested tests like suites within the suites, move them to different classes to separate them. Final thing I want to mention is Spring Test, because a lot of us are working with Spring. Not much to say here. Both TestNG and JUnit, if you work with Spring and Spring Boot, they come with a Spring Boot test. The only difference is that in JUnit, it's enough to put Spring Boot test here, but it's not enough for TestNG. I think this is a bug that wasn't fixed, but it's not enough, or a design feature. So it's not enough to put the annotation Spring Boot test in order to load Spring into the TestNG test. You have to extend the class from the test. Is that important? If you're writing base classes for tests, yes. So you have the base class because Java is single inheritance, that means you have the base class to inherit from this. Not that big a deal. Might create some conflicts maybe, but I don't see it as a big deal. It's a bit noisy, but again, nobody sees that. But other than that, you should remember that just putting Spring Boot test on a TestNG class doesn't make it a Spring TestNG test. Okay, that was 10 features. There are a few more, by the way, of differences, not that big. Who won? So the question is not really who's winning the war. The question is, if I'm using one, should I switch to another? If I'm starting a new project, which I choose? So the question for the first one is there's no need to change. If your people are accustomed to working with TestNG, yes, they can start writing tests with JUnit 5. There's not going to be like a big steep learning curve here. If you're starting a new one, go with JUnit 5. And the reason it's like it's newer and shinier, it can get a few more implemented experiences under its belt. It's not a big deal though. I am concerned about the different behaviors I see in the integration space though. With Eclipse, and now the one I saw with IDEA. You need to check exactly what you're doing, not just in terms of engine, but how it looks and behaves in your whole mix of system. So is JUnit 5 better? Probably for the long run, but neither is much better than the other in terms of a good excuse to switch. So I don't see, I don't think it's switching. And that's basically what I wanted to show you today. So what I'm going to do is that, again, if you found this interesting, great. If it's helpful, even better. If you want my help in helping you test better and develop better, this is how you do it. And you can contact me at gil@testnggil or tal@testnggil.com about this stuff as well. How to write unit test cases with DB interaction involved. I'm aware of Mockito, but just want to check if there are anything we can really useful to check the DB interaction part. Okay, so if you're using Mockito, you're blocking out the database interaction. You can check how you're sending stuff to the database, and you can mock whatever you receive from it. So that's a way to do it. If you're working with Spring, you can use not just with Spring, but Spring makes it a lot easier to use in-memory databases, which allows you to run integration tests in memory in isolated containers, not with the whole system. So you can use both JUnit and TestNG for running integration tests. The result depends on your code, but if you're testing interaction with database, so you can run without the database, like with Mockito, or with a database, which kind of spans in two ways, either in in-memory database, which will discontinue to run at the end of the tests, which is kind of cool for an isolated test, or with a real database that you can run with that as well, but then you need to make sure the database is there full of whatever you need. If you're using not a SQL database, but a key value pair or like Redis or something like that, it's easier to mock that. Like you can just put in an array, a dictionary, and everything will work easily or not so easily. Will the others be executed if the first assert all fails? Yes. Assert all runs everything, runs everything in the assert all. That's the main purpose of it. So you get everything and you get all the results of all the asserts. 20 years ago, the thinking was that if one fails, the test should just fail regardless. The thinking today is that it's not enough to fail the test, because once the test fails, we kind of need to figure out what happened, and maybe the rest of the asserts will tell us. And this is where the assert all came from. I think there's a way to change this default failing on the first test in JUnit and TestNG to run everything. So I think today assert all is kind of an expansion of something that you can do that most people don't know how to do. So assert all grouped assertings are there. Use them instead of multiple asserts. Isn't display name just a God application? Ooh, that's a very good question. Well, no. First of all, no, because display name has a functional place, because it will actually be there in the report. So it actually replaces the name. It's there to create a more displayable names rather than just using things in underscores in the name of the test. Now, question is, can I do it with the name of the test already? And that really becomes on where you're coming from. If you're coming from the JavaScript world, when you're accustomed to read like a book instead of a test name, it might be, but it suffers from the same thing like a comment. You may start out with the name of the test and the name of the test as well, and the test will test something else, and then the name will be different. So it is sort of a code duplication. Is it that awful? No. Does it suffer from the problems of code duplication? Maybe yes. Are these frameworks used only for unit tests? No. They're unit test frameworks by design, but they are test engines, so they can run everything you want. Is that good for everything you want? That's another question, because again, it comes back to what you're actually running. So are they used correctly? It really depends on what they're actually running. Timeouts. Okay, so the question is for the timeouts and the cleanup, and someone asks, Sasha asked, whether we can use after test after each to clean up, and the answer is yes, it will run, but the problem is that if your test engine breaks the test, you don't know at what point it actually broke it. So you're not in control, and you may want to clean up something that haven't been dirty yet. So it gives you a bit more effort to put into the cleanout. So I think that at least for the timeout thing, you better clean up in the Lambda expression rather than outside. We're running out of time. IMR asks, what about listeners with JUnit? You have listeners in both JUnit and TestNG, so you can expand your reporting. Most people don't do that. That's I haven't talked about. JUnit 5 was built from the ground up because it was needed to expand. So it was actually built in the way that it could integrate better. But both TestNG does that, and that's you can create your own listeners, and most people don't do that. So most of people use a CI tool that reads everything and just do that, but listeners are used to create better reporting. I'm going to stop answering questions now, although I have a few. I'll try to write answers for them in the posts I'm going to do, and I actually do, so you can follow me. Where you can follow me? You can follow me everywhere, and I post with Tal's help on LinkedIn and Xing and Twitter and Facebook and Telegram. I actually need to put Facebook here. And you can follow me, and if you haven't gotten to questions that you ask, I hope to answer them in the upcoming posts that I'm going to post. Thank you for coming here today, and if it's interesting for you, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next webinar. Bye bye. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Thanks for the support, and remember, live long and test.